Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sean Langsbury. I'm the Special Collections Services Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. I do want to take this moment to acknowledge that we've gathered together at the Central Library, which occupies indigenous land, Seattle being traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people, and we strive to honor their elders past, present, and future, and we thank them for their stewardship of this land. The library welcomes you all today to our book launch for A Will to Serve. We're so pleased to bring tonight's esteemed panelists to you, and we thank our co-sponsor, HistoryLink, for making this important book and this event a reality. We also want to acknowledge the Seattle Public Library Foundation, who support programming and resources for the library and its patron year-round through tireless advocacy and fundraising. We want to thank the foundation and the generosity of foundation donors.
Even knew of Jim Ellis, you have almost certainly benefited from his legacy. This man transformed our region further than almost any other individual in the 20th century. He was a remarkable citizen. Just consider this: if you swim in Lake Washington, or you fish in Lake Washington, or you boat in Lake Washington, you had Jim Ellis to thank for it being unpolluted. If you have ridden on our buses, you are prospering from a system he helped create. If you enjoy some of our grandest parks, Luther Burbank, Marymoor, Discovery, Gasworks, you have done so because of Jim Ellis. If you have hiked some of our best nature trails, you are walking quite literally on his work. The Downtown Aquarium, that's Jim Ellis. Freeway Park, that's Jim Ellis. The Kingdom and the wonderful sports teams it brought to our region, that was Jim Ellis. We also owe him gratitude for the farmlands he helped preserve, the convention center he helped build, and that amazing green corridor from the mountains to Sound that he helped protect. And all these, they are just his highlight reel. Jim Ellis can be found almost everywhere you look. Now, many of you here today know the rough outlines of his legacy, but now, decades after that extraordinary work began, we finally have his full story in his own words. And it is, we can surely say, his final achievement. A book that recounts all of his service with fun color and even sentimentality, but that also supplies a blueprint for how it was done. And that is key to all of this. We study Jim Ellis to be awed, yes, but we also study Jim Ellis quite simply because we want more of them. And his book is meant to be read and to be followed. Certainly our distinguished panelists today are examples of that. They represent the direct and indirect civic offspring of Jim Ellis and this marvelous man. Some of them knew him, all of them embodied him. And it is a treat that they are here to bring this leader and this legacy to life. But before that, a couple other openers to help set the table this afternoon. First off, a voice who also typifies the civic spirit we salute today. Marie McCaffrey is the recently retired Executive Director of HistoryLink. She has been in service to all the communities she's lived in her adult life, including this one. In fact, she was on the board of this very institution, the library, for 10 years and served as a term as its president. Marie was, without doubt, the central force and inspiration behind the entire Ellis project. Without her foresight, without her sweat, this book never would have happened. And it was harder than it looks, as you'll learn. Indeed, it is a fitting irony that it took Jim Ellis' perseverance to bring about the Jim Ellis book. Ladies and gentlemen, Marie McCaffrey.
I'm really pleased to be here in this cathedral of knowledge, Seattle Public Library, one of my favorite places in the entire city. This book was a long time coming. I shouldn't play favorites, but this is the thing that I am most proud of that I have done in the whole time that I have led HistoryLink. Over 6 years ago, Chairman of the board, Bob Royer, and his friend Christopher Bailey came to me with an idea. They had discovered that Jim Ellis had written a memoir, and they believed HistoryLink should publish it. Now, today, I stand before you with this book. I won't bore you with the whole story of how we got here, but I want to tell you why. When my late husband, Walt Crowley, and I founded HistoryLink with Paul Dorpat in 1997, the driving motive was the civic health of our community. We believed then, as I do today, that understanding the past makes an informed citizenry, which is critical to the functioning of democracy. At the top of the list of those citizens that Walton held in the highest regard was Jim Ellis. Always dreaming, always fighting, Jim Ellis never surrendered to defeat, changing the place we live in incrementally and profoundly. To quote Cassandra Tate, Jim Ellis never held public office and never headed a major corporation. Yet, as a citizen activist for more than half a century, he left a bigger footprint on Seattle and King County than perhaps any other single individual. Walt learned by watching Jim Ellis and applied what he learned to make change. Creating HistoryLink was his last civic contribution. Thanks to the Ellis family, to Sally Jewell, Jared Smith, Jen Ott, Elisa Law, Peter Beck, and many others who were able to honor Walt's hero and muse with this book and project, which I know he would have loved. And as my final act for HistoryLink, I get to share with you the lessons of Jim Ellis. My hope is that they will be put to use.
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Ott. I'm the incoming executive director at HistoryLink, but I was also lucky to be one of the contributors to this book. I was able to write the last chapter about the Mountains of Sound Greenway Trust, which was a beloved project, of course, of Jim's. And so I want to speak a little bit to the process of being involved in this book. I wanted to talk about what a remarkable experience it was to get to work on. I got to know Jim Ellis through his writing. I had never got to meet him in person. And so to be able to dive into the draft of his book and see how he thought about things and how he connected things was a really fascinating experience. And I learned about what was important to him and how he viewed his life. And I love a good biography because there's nothing like that sense of how do all these pieces come together. And how does somebody view the successes and failures of what they've done? I also got the amazing opportunity to work with Sally Jewell and Governor Barry Locke to put the book together and to learn from their personal connections to Jim and their lived experience and their leadership, how they enhanced Jim's message when they added their sections to the book was a really remarkable experience, and I appreciate it. I have to thank Peter Beck with Documentary Media, who I just saw come in. He is our publisher, and he's an absolute joy to work with, and he shepherded this beautiful book to publication. He just knows how to create a work of art out of words and pictures. And I have to thank our editor, Tori Smith, also. She did an amazing job putting this manuscript together. To edit without having the author there to ask questions of is quite a challenge, and she just has a very adept hand and intuition. I have to thank the Ellis family, who are just the most lovely people. It was amazing to get to know you through these several years we've worked together, and I appreciate that. And the Mountains of Sound Greenway Trust community. I think I interviewed about 20 of you, And I've gotten the opportunity to meet and talk with you, and it's such an inspiring group. I was just at their event on Friday, and you can't help but want to jump in and join their cause because they are doing great things. But this book I want to talk about is an excellent example of one of my favorite things about studying history is you hear about big ideas, you hear that they happened or they failed, but you don't often hear in the general discourse about how it happened. What are the actual mechanisms of going from a big idea, a vision, to making it work? And with Jim, there were several layers to how he did that. There was, of course, his family, and Mary Lou in particular. There was also the more mundane, everyday sort of work part of his life, that he was a municipal bond lawyer. And my personal favorite thing for history is civil engineering. I'm a cement buff. And I love to see how you can take an expertise in a particular area and apply it to an idea and use that base of knowledge to make something happen. And if you look at the projects that Jim realized, a lot of them have that connection of building the trust, making sure all the details are carefully attended to, and knowing that you're building a relationship of trust with people. I also, sorry, lost my spot there, I get to talking. And so the adage that knowledge is power is so, so true. With knowledge, we have more tools in our civic toolbox. We have knowledge to join and have the confidence to join the civic conversation. And we can use that knowledge to be confident voters. That's such a key part of HistoryLink's mission, is to inform the electorate and have people make informed decisions about what we've tried to do in the past and what we want to do in the future. And so Jim's story shows us a path forward for how we can make this place a better place to live for our own community, but also for future generations to come. And I hope that you're as inspired when you read it as I have been. I want to encourage you that this is just one part of the Ellis project that we've been working on. Please stop by our table of information and learn more about the other elements, including the archives here that we'll talk about later. So thank you again for being here today, and I will pass it back to CR. Thank you.
Okay, before we summon our panel to the stage, there is one more voice to present today that will certainly focus us all directly on our subject. Jim Ellis sat for many interviews over the years, including one with me, and so it's very apt that beyond hearing about him today, we also hear from him today. Of the many projects Jim led over his productive life, none was as comprehensive as Forward Thrust. That was in the late 60s and early 70s. Indeed, that phrase has woven itself into our civic vocabulary. Today, you will hear Jim Ellis chronicle that effort. He also shares what inspired him to commit to not just a lifetime of service, but to not just a series of services, but to a lifetime of them. It wasn't one-off activism. His was a decades-long pattern of rinse and repeat. And it was all born of a personal tragedy, as you'll hear. So on this special day where we gather to praise Jim Ellis, you can imagine what a treat it is for me to present Jim Ellis.
Forward Thrust was an extraordinarily ambitious effort to bring to the people a program of capital improvements that would cover almost everything. The idea was we wouldn't just have a bond issue for one thing. We would have a series of them covering all the capital needs that were becoming apparent at that time. This is in the 60s, and we were in a huge Boeing boom, and we needed almost everything, and it looked like a good time to be planning as a whole instead of taking one and doing it. We knew it was risky. We also knew that the magnitude of it was exciting. And the possibility of uniting the different advocacy groups. You know, some folks want swimming pools, some folks want golf courses, some folks want transit, highways, parks. We thought if we could get these put together, we might unite them in a one-for-all kind of campaign. It was a time of optimism and of confidence in leadership, business, civic, and political leadership. It wasn't divided by party, and that was one of the exciting things that happened during that period of time. We went to double the borrowing capacity of the county, for example, because we felt the county was the logical borrower for so many of these things which stretched across the cities and included the cities. And rather than have 20 separate votes, we thought we'll have a county vote, and then we'll divide up the projects according to the taxable values of these cities, and we'll spell them all out. If you can imagine, this thing was endorsed by all of the cities in the county. That's amazing. Unanimously by the county council, unanimously by the Metro Council. These were huge expressions of unanimity. Why don't we take part of our life and do something that you and Bob would have wanted to do for him? And I said, you mean like take a quarter of our time and do projects that Bob would have wanted to do? She says, yes, like conservation. She used that word. And I said, you know, honey, that's a hell of a good idea. We need to figure out ways that we can live with this beautiful natural setting without killing it. We have to learn to get along with the natural environment, and that means finding those environments that can accept heavy use and finding those environments that can't, and matching our use to what they can handle. And then we'll have them over time. The things you build that you think are going to last forever, and they may be torn down, they may change. They almost certainly will. And I think if you really look at this experience, it tells me that it isn't the trees planted or the people helped or the buildings built or the water cleaned. It is rather that citizens cared enough to do it. That's what I've learned. And that we can't ever do without.
You certainly get a sense of his style and his warmth and his commitment. And I want to say that those wonderful moments that we just saw, Jim, by the way, were taken from a larger documentary co-produced by none other than John Arthur Wilson, your King County assessor. John, in his former incarnation, was a journalist, and he is here today. And we thank John for preserving those wonderful moments. And John had nothing to do with the video glitches. They were presented.
I installed my own earlier.
Yeah. the library has been a victim of a sabotage hack. And so that may be the problem, that the internet here is down, actually. So anyway, on now to the main attraction, finally. Our very noteworthy panelists this afternoon are extremely well known in this community and beyond, and thus hardly require any description from me. Complete bios are included in your programs of their impressive work and of their lofty positions. They have risen up through somewhat different professions and somewhat different pathways, but there is a sameness that brings them together today. A deep regard for the man we are honoring and for the kind of service he rendered. Gary Locke worked with Jim Ellis. Sally Jewell was mentored by Jim Ellis. Eric Liu was inspired by Jim Ellis. And Gurmai Zahile is helping to manage Jim Ellis, his metro government, that is. Please welcome them all.
That's good.
Gary Locke, you worked with Jim Ellis on a number of projects over the years. You wrote the foreword to this book, as it's been mentioned. You go into some detail about the Convention Center. Describe that project a bit and your interaction with Jim Ellis on that.
Well, thank you, CR. But first of all, let me just thank all the supporters of the book project. I see a lot of folks that worked with him at his law firm, Preston Gates and Ellis, now K&L Gates, Pacifica Law Group, and the generosity of the Ellis family and so many other individuals, civic leaders from across the region have been very generous in making this book project possible. I was in the state legislature. I'd always learned and heard about Jim Ellis, but had never met him. I actually did, in the 6th grade, a report about Metro, the formation of the cleanup of Lake Washington. Coming here
You're
to
a true
the
policy nerd that you were doing that in 6th grade.
coming to the Seattle Public Library and looking up all the microfiche of the construction of the sewage treatment plants and seeing these huge concrete pipes that trucks could actually go through. So from then on, I was just mesmerized by the name and awe of the name Jim Ellis. But I did not meet him until I think it was in the late 1980s. The convention center was being proposed over the freeway, and it was going to be a public-private partnership between the state of Washington and several for-profit companies. But the project went into trouble. The construction company went bankrupt, and some of the financial institutions backing the construction company also went under. And so Jim came to the state, and we were about to adjourn, and he came to the state and said, hey, can the state provide some bridge financing? And I'm sure we'll figure out all the financing and of the bankruptcies and get underway. There was huge hostility to this proposal and huge hostility to Jim Ellis specifically and individually. I was stunned. Mm-hmm. There were legislators, prominent members of the state Senate, who actually called for an investigation and a criminal investigation of Jim Ellis, saying he was a crook, he was conniving the state, it was a boondoggle, and that there should be no funding. At the very last minute, the legislature did agree to provide some funding, and I volunteered to head up a task force to really look at all the issues surrounding it. And Jim Ellis then, I remember when Jim was in the legislature trying to get funding, we were in the speaker's office and he pulled out the blueprints and the schematics of the convention center onto the floor, and he was actually on the floor himself on his hands and knees pointing out this and this and that. I was just so stunned that this guy had so much passion and was willing to just do anything. And then we crawled around the convention center, which was where construction had stopped. There were rats in the Eagles Auditorium, which is now ACT Theater, and we went through it. In the end, the task force decided that the convention center public-private partnership was a bad idea because the state would have owned and run all the losing portions of the project, and the private sector would have all the profit-generating portions of the project. And we said, that's not a good idea. So I actually met with Jim Ellis at the end of our task force in the Sheraton Hotel in the coffee shop. And he sat over there and I sat over there, separate tables. I kind of doodled out a proposal. Jim came on over, handed it to him. And the idea was the convention center as planned was too small. It was going to be outdated and really incapable of hosting all these conventions from the very get-go. So I proposed that we significantly expand it and it'd be 100% state. And Jim agreed. Then we had to go to the legislature and convince people that this was a good idea. Because this was more money, and we were taking on what many people thought was an albatross. But we were able to prevail because we had Democrats and Republicans on that task force. And they had credibility in the legislature, and that's how it is.
And what are the 2-3 traits you remember most about him in those negotiations and in that project?
Well, he loved the idea of expanding the convention center.
He was big picture.
Because subsequently the convention center has been expanded many more times. What I remember about Jim is that nothing was beneath him. I mean, he's willing to crawl through the rafters and walk through the dark, dingy parts of the construction in his infamous trench coat. I don't know if it's London fog or whatever, that tan trench coat. But nothing was beyond him, and he was so humble. He didn't have airs about him, given all the success of Forward Thrust and all these other initiatives. He was just constantly coming up with new ideas and pushing them forward, and willing to work with people and even take the personal arrows and aimed at him. I don't know how much of a toll it had on him, but outwardly, it didn't faze him. He was just focused on the end goal.
Sally Jewell, you worked closely with him on what was his really last project, the Mountains to Sound Greenway. I'm happy to say it's been noted that you wrote the foreword to this book, talking about that experience. Describe that in more detail. What did you learn from working with Jim Ellis on that project?
Just about everything that I've used since that time. You know, I was 34 when I met Jim, who was 68, which is my age now. So when he took on the Mountains to Sound Greenway, he was this age, which is pretty extraordinary because it's a big project. And I remember saying to him, well, Jim, this seems like it's, you know, it's like at least a 25-year project. And he said, yeah. So I became involved, and this was consistent throughout Jim's talking to the titans of industry, and of course he ran with the titans of industry. When he asked them for money for the Mountains to Sound Greenway, and he asked them for $75,000, this is back in 1991, and to a person they said, and this was Frank Schranz at Boeing, George Weyerhaeuser, anyway, he called John Mangles, who was running the bank that I was with, and they all said, we'll give you $75,000, but we don't have time to join your board, which he also asked them to join. And each of them offered up someone, and I got offered up. And that's how I got to know him. And I was a baby executive. They promoted me quickly, but they said, well, you seem to like hiking in the outdoors. Why don't you do this? So what a gift that was. What a gift. As Gary explained about the convention center, Jim was just a font of enthusiasm, continuous, infectious enthusiasm, who really did like to get his way. But he did it in such an enthusiastic and positive way, and he wasn't always right, but he was mostly right, and he did listen. What struck me the most was as he was assembling the Greenway board, which, you know, I had the privilege of joining in those early days, as did a number of other people. How many on the original board members are in the audience? Bill Chapman, Doug McClelland,
Yeah.
just a handful, but there's a few of us around. We were all babies, actually almost exactly the same age, in our low to mid 30s. And he insisted on having people on that board who were citizen activists, who were best known in North Bend, having a young banker from Kittitas County that had the unfortunate nickname for a long time after joining this, Terry Walgren, of Mr. Greenbelt, because he was in, pretty conservative part of the Greenway. He brought in, just local civic leaders and people and activists. And the one thing he insisted on, and I see Nancy Keith here, who was executive director of the Greenway, and I saw Donna McBain up there. You guys raise your hands. These are the first and the second executive directors of the Greenway. Donna as an employee of the Trust for Public Land, which was, the sort of entity that hosted the Greenway until it flew on its own. Jim always insisted on buying people dinner. And he knew that if he sat the titans of industry across the table, and he insisted on round tables, from the citizen activist in North Bend, or Charlie Raines with the Sierra Club, who was so instrumental in the wildlife crossings that we now have, and in the sort of the whole tenacious focus on cleaning up the checkerboards along I-90. When they sat down together, they got to know each other. So you had Weyerhaeuser and Quadrant Homes, which would have developed that entire ridge, Rattlesnake Ridge. This was Donna's first project. If you go to North Bend and the main exit to North Bend, if you look to the right, it's green and it's growing, and it all would have been houses. And people do need a place to live. But do we really have to have every intersection developed? Do we really have to have every hillside that's closed in, full of houses? And Jim helped us understand that no, we don't. So when I was Secretary of the Interior, I thought of Jim all the time. I thought, how would Jim do this? How would he get the right people around the table? What people should I have around the table? How do we create an environment where they build a relationship across political divides, across, geographic divides, as we work together in service of not just today and current generations, but the generations that are yet unborn. So that's, I can go on and I will stop.
Well, you'll have a chance to go on. That's great. Gurmai Zahile, you came of age long after Jim Ellis's legacy and heyday. And yet you're unique on this panel, as I mentioned, because you're actually connected directly to his legacy. You are a King County Council member. Jim Ellis, so much of his efforts built the base of King County, the sewage and wastewater treatment facilities, the bus system, parks, trails, growth management principles. How important was all that work to the work you're doing now at Metro?
It's everything. I'm not like the governor or the secretary. I didn't get a chance to work directly with Jim Ellis, but I had heard the name before, and then when I got invited to this panel, I did more research, and I was like, oh my God, King County Wastewater, King County Metro, King County Trails, King County Parks.
He did everything I'm working on.
He did everything, so I feel like I'm a steward of his legacy, but also I feel like I have a job because of him, so I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan.
How is it faring? Do you feel like, he always said what his work was a beginning and not an end. That he started things, but that it was never, you saw the kingdom, right? They weren't going to last forever. The spirit was, but not every project. How is some of the infrastructure that he's responsible for faring?
It's great. I feel like these are the projects that he worked on for King County are the most direct ways that we touch people's lives. And so I feel like he is allowing everyday citizens to know that if you are active, if you engage, that you can make a difference. You can actually touch people's lives. And so I'm just so grateful, and I hope more people learn about him, because I think the more they learn about what he's done, the more it can inspire them to feel like if there's a problem out there, that is a creative puzzle to solve, that I can rally the right number of people to do the right things to get an outcome. I think that's the most powerful message you can share.
And you are doing some of that work, which we're going to get to a little bit later. But let me bring in our final panelists. Eric Liu, you have been doing Ellis-like things in this region for 25 years. I met you, I think, when you first got here. When did you first encounter his legacy, and what does it mean to you?
Well, first of all, I actually want to answer that question kind of indirectly in a way that is human. Marie mentioned that we're in this cathedral of democracy. When I first came, I didn't grow up in Seattle. When I first started coming here in the mid-90s, One of the first people I met was then, I think, County Executive Gary Locke, who, among other people, like David Brewster, who had founded Town Hall and Seattle Weekly and other institutions, said, you really ought to know about this guy, Jim Ellis, if you want to understand what this town is about and what the culture of this place is. And those conversations led me to meet not long after Greg and Sharon Nichols when Greg was mayor. And Greg put me on the library board here in Seattle, and that's how Marie and I met. And there are just all these different cross connections that aren't even about institutions, but they're just about people and just about relationships and about trust and about the, we got a little glimpse of it in the video. And when you read the book, which I hope you all will do, and you read the passages not only about the death of Jim's brother Bob, but his relationship with his wife Mary Lou, and the depth of that love and that partnership was love. It was civic love. It was just this kind of thing that was a beating heart of what we're talking about here. And I think, when you get 2-3 generations on from a big bang legacy set of projects like that, it can get, I'm sure you're fighting this all the time, you get very bureaucratic. It can just be about moving the pieces and turning the dials and stuff like that. And seeing the Ellis family in front of me here, it's like, no, this is about the beating heart of people and their commitment and their love and their relationships. And when I first got to town, it was people who said, you ought to understand that. This is not just a place where stuff happens. This is a place where there's a culture in which somebody like Jim Ellis can be formed, but then someone like Jim Ellis will raise his hand and say, I think we could do better than have a polluted lake. I think we could do better as we're growing than sit in long, forever traffic jams. I think we could do better than just tearing down hillsides and filling up with Insta housing and all that stuff, right? I think we can do better. And that was a culture that was different from where I'd grown up in the East Coast, where, the vibe was, who sent you? Have you paid your dues? And nice idea, wait 25 years and maybe you can put it in the mix, rather than this culture that Jim Ellis both embodied and kind of accelerated, a culture of civic entrepreneurship. And I think we think of ourselves here in Seattle in the Northwest as being this capital of business entrepreneurship, and we are. But I'll tell you, my work at Citizen University brings me into contact with people all around the United States. Big cities, small towns, red places, blue places, and we remain exceptional in the country, not just for our business entrepreneurial culture, but for our civic entrepreneurial culture. The way in which on a Sunday afternoon people will show up to a gathering like this, and when it starts raining harder, think not, oh, I'm going to stay home, but think, I better dig up my raincoat, right? Because I'm going to this thing because it's part of a set of relationships and a legacy here. And and so I just wanted to kind of name that from the beginning, like just the human side of this. Our work at Citizen University is all about trying to foster a culture of powerful, responsible citizenship. And we talk about that culture in ways that, culture is a very abstract word, but if you kind of set it against structure, one way to measure the legacy of Jim Ellis is to point at buildings, parks, freeways, and greenways and the rest. And that is a built infrastructure. It's a physical infrastructure. But culture is a spiritual infrastructure. Culture, the norms, the values, the story we tell about who we are and what kind of place this is, that stuff can disappear a lot faster than 25 years. Mm-hmm. That stuff can evaporate. We can still have buildings and theaters and the rest, but those habits of the heart, as Alexis de Tocqueville called them, have to be renewed a whole lot more often, right? And so we're gathered here today not just to kind of like go down that list and be like, holy cow, that was one guy who catalyzed all that. And here are among the people who are his mentees and legacy and so forth and steward. But also like, holy cow, I'm not sure our culture today is as strong civically as it was in 68, 69, 70, 75, 82, all those years when these things were happening. And what's our responsibility for actually fortifying it? How should we show up in a way to understand things about how you get stuff done, about when you see a problem, how you raise your hand to deal with it? And again, that's why this book is indispensable. It's not just, with everything with History Link, it's not just, why do we study history? Why do we read a biography, right? Not just to kind of lose ourselves in another time, but actually to think about to hold a great multifaceted mirror up to our own times and ourselves, and to face ourselves. And if we face ourselves honestly right now, as a city, as a county, as a state, as a country, we're not fully living up to the spirit of Jim Ellis as a people. And I think, we in this room are, I guess, but we, the people, are not. And I think that's, to me, that feeling, it's a feeling. And it's the same feeling I got when Gary first told me over a coffee, probably at the Sheraton, actually, where you and Jim kind of, scribbled your proposals for the convention center. You ought to look up this guy, Jim Ellis.
Sally, let me. Sally, one thing that was sort of legendary within the Mountains to Sound Greenway were those Greenway dinners, and talk about how that gives us more light into Jim Ellis's style and what we can learn from them if we want to do projects like that.
There's a phrase that I love that I didn't hear from Jim, but Jim embodied, and that is that progress moves at the speed of trust. And breaking bread with someone, sitting across the table from someone you don't know and getting to know them is incredibly important when it comes to building trust. And what I saw emerge were labels. For me, Rainier Bank. For somebody else, it was Weyerhaeuser. It was civic activist, it was elected official, but when you got around the table, it was Gene and it was Charlie, and you built a relationship that became far deeper where the labels fell away. And that's when you begin to listen to each other. And when you listen to each other, you realize that the assumptions you made were incorrect. And it doesn't take long at all to find common ground. And I think when the setting is the Preston Community Center, which I think is now also named for Jim, which is very close to the Raging River cabin that you will read about in the book, which is just a super fun story that Jim liked to tell over and over again. It's still in the hands of the family. When you're out of the city, or you're driving over from Kittitas County and meeting in this little community hall, you get to know people as people. And there are a number of you out there that I got to know in that way. And, we change because we listen. We change because we understand a different person's point of view. And what we find, and Jim is just the master of this, is that there's always common ground. We focus on the intersection of those interests, not on our points of difference. And he was so good at that. I will say that, Jim was a lifelong Republican. And I remember that we had tremendous support in Washington, D.C. In fact, we used to say the Greenway's better known in Washington, D.C. than it is in Washington State, because we were early recipients of lots of Forest Legacy money, which helped permanently protect and put in DNR's hands things like Rattlesnake Ridge that I mentioned. I didn't support the candidates Jim asked me to support on a few occasions.
I hope he supported me.
I supported you, and I'm sure he did too. But he and Slade Gorton were close friends, and I was supporting Maria Cantwell, who knocked him out. Felt a little bad about that because he'd done so much for the Greenway, but it didn't matter to Jim. What mattered to Jim was making sure that everybody understood how the system worked, thanked people that made a difference within that system, no matter what their contributions were. And it was those dinners, which are usually Italian food, which is a good way to bring yourselves together.
And those dinners, if I remember right from the book, they were your monthly Mountains to Sound Greenway meetings, your board meetings.
They were.
With this whole group of very diverse people, and you ate before you met.
Yes,
Is that correct?
that's right.
to develop those ties, to develop those connections.
And they were not just Greenway board members, they were technical advisory committee members, they were community members, they were tribal members, all getting together to know each other. And that's the way Jim operated. And I mean, the board itself was, I don't know, at least 60 members, probably more, and then the technical advisory committee even more. And so these were large gatherings of people that really got to know each other. And it's a place where people came to present, many times walking away with more ideas than I think they hoped that they would have. But they changed the nature of the work they were going to do because of those meetings, and it became kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval for those old enough to remember that, for projects within the Greenway, because people had come and they listened and they reshaped and they came back with renewed proposals, and that's why we have so much of what we have today.
Gurmaiza Healy, Jim Ellis, as we've noted, did not seek elected office pretty deliberately. He was tempted many times and he was pushed many times to do it, but he always felt it was easier to focus on these projects from a private citizen perspective. You chose to be an elected representative. You chose to serve in that way. You have served before you got elected, but this is now your role, your perch. What's the upside and downside of trying to change and be a civic activist from elected office versus private citizen?
So let me answer that in a little bit of a different way. What Eric was talking about in terms of cultural infrastructure, I thought was such a profound point, because one of the most shocking statistics that I heard when I first got on the King County Council was a study that was released by the CDC. And the CDC found that the percentage of high school students who today are experiencing levels of depression, anxiety, disconnection has skyrocketed since 2010. And we can all hypothesize about what those reasons are. You know, some people say social media, war, lack of economic opportunity, et cetera.
Pandemic.
But anecdotally, when I go and talk to the high school students in my district, one of the number one things that they tell me is that I feel like problems keep getting worse and I am powerless to stop that from happening. I feel like I'm powerless. And that leads to a sense of depression and a sense of powerlessness. So I feel like teaching young people that problems are not a fixed, inherent thing. They are a creative puzzle to solve. And if you identify the right tools, you can use those tools to solve those problems. But it's so hard to find what those tools are because I feel like the civic education that they're getting is not as strong as it should be. I actually don't know what the education landscape is today, but I know when I was in school, I didn't have a lot of civic education. And so what I try to share with young people now is that you are not powerless. You are powerful. You just haven't been given the right tools to solve those problems. So I started an organization like Build the Bench to teach young people that through civic activism, through civic engagement, that they can solve the problems that they see in their neighborhoods. And I also teach them that running for office is only one of those tools. You do not have to run for office to solve problems. You should actually not start with the problem statement. You should look inward and ask yourself, what is my gift? And once you have identified what your gift is, I promise you there is a way to use that gift to solve problems. And that does not have to be running for office. If your gift is writing books, your gift is organizing events, your gift is art, your gift is music, your gift is advocating to the state legislator to get money, like that. Those are all things that can solve problems. And so that's my way of answering it.
I think that's a very important point. I think Jim Ellis clearly knew his gifts and that they were as a private citizen and using that perch. He really excelled at that, obviously. Gary Locke. We tend to think of his career as a series of Grand Slam home runs, that there were never setbacks, there were never disappointments. You know, I mean, it is an impressive list, but when you go through each of them, you described a little bit at the convention center, it wasn't all smooth sailing. It required, it seems to me, someone with an immense amount of optimism and perseverance because there were setbacks. We should say the Kingdome did not win on the first ballot. The cleanup of Lake Washington did not win on the first ballot. The bus rapid transit system did not win on the first ballot. This man went back to achieve his ends a number of times. Describe that kind of personality.
Well, it's amazing that he would continue to persevere and push forward despite these setbacks. I think oftentimes when a project fails, the political leaders and the civic leaders will scale down the project significantly in order to get the support, reduce the costs, or what have you. But Jim didn't do that because that would have been sacrificing the ultimate quality and the ultimate objective. I mean, sometimes it's better to have nothing than to have a fraction of something that really doesn't serve the needs of the community or meet the aspirations of the community. I think one of the biggest disappointments, at least from a citizen standpoint, from my personal standpoint, was the failure of rapid rail. And in those days, ballot measures seeking funding required a 60% vote, not a simple majority of today. And even today, with a simple majority, we're having a lot of projects that are being turned down by the voters. So think of how daunting a task it was to try to get 60% of the voters to approve something. We came so close. And think of what the region would have been like if we had had rapid transit. And this was going back many, many decades. And that money ultimately, and it was mostly federally funded. That was the irony of the thing. It was almost, what was it?
90%.
90% federal funds, and we were just being asked to chip in 10%. That money eventually went to Atlanta, and they have a really beautiful subway system. And you know, here we are with Sound Transit. It's going to. Here's an aside. China, since the Beijing Olympics in 2008, has built over 17,000 miles of high-speed rail. That's enough to crisscross America 6 times. And here we are struggling with Sound Transit, and Sound Transit will not make it from Mercer Island to Issaquah until 2040, going at, what, 30 miles an hour? And it's only about a 10-mile stretch. And anyway, I'm just so amazed that Jim would continue to persevere and take on additional projects. You know, you asked the question to Gurmai about whether or not, you know, why he wasn't an elected official. Unfortunately, I think in today's political climate, a person like Jim Ellis, if he were in office, would not be able to get the community support that he was able to get back then. Because today, if you're identified as a Democrat or Republican, you have automatic barriers of opposition and people who close their eyes and you know and don't listen and aren't willing to even consider the project, even if you have a meal, you know, beforehand. So going back to Eric's comment about institution of culture, cultural institution, I think that's what we really need now to focus on. We need people to step forward and dream. You know, what do we want this region to be like 30 years from now? And it's more than just infrastructure now. It's the issue of affordable housing. It's about mental health services. It's about education, a high-quality education. It's about
Climate change.
yeah, it's about so much more. And those are going to be harder to achieve because, you know, a freeway, a park, a swimming pool, very tangible. When it's done, you see it, you enjoy it. How do you know when you've reached the goal of better education or of adequate mental health services or reducing homelessness? So anyway.
Eric Liu, You talked about it, Citizen University. You are trying to really create more Jim Ellises, and Jim Ellis wanted more Jim Ellises. Part of this whole project is to help spread the word and create another generation of those kinds of folks. You've got Citizen University. You're trying to do just that. What are you doing? What are the challenges and what are the hopes?
You know, I think what we're doing is actually a bit of what we've already been hearing on the panel. One of the ways that we think about our work in trying to foster this culture of powerful, responsible citizenship is to invite people, both young people, as Gramai was describing, having worked with, and people our age who are the product of a system which didn't give us sufficient civic education, but are still in the world as citizens. And one of the most basic things we teach in our work and our programs is a simple equation to understand what we mean by citizenship. And that equation is power plus character equals citizenship. That to live like a citizen, I'm not talking documentation status, passport, I mean to be a member of the body requires both a literacy in power, to understand what power is, who has it, who does not have it, how it flows, through what channels, formal and informal, how you move things in order to kind of direct the flow of that. And to gain that literacy, both in the reading of power and being able to understand a situation, but also the writing of it. How do you actually put forth a plan? Get on your hands and knees if you have to and kind of map out what the plan would be for mobilizing money support, idea support, political support, vote support for an idea. That's one half of the equation, literacy and power. And a lot of what Gramai you were talking about, when we encounter young people in our lives, this was a book I wrote recently called You're More Powerful Than You Think, Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen. And it's speaking exactly to that sense of learned helplessness, of kind of overwhelm. The problems are too big, they're too complicated, I'm too small. This whole age is meant to make us feel small and inconsequential, this age of, that's the other thing that's changed since the age of peak Jim Ellis, is that we are so much more an unequal society, county, state, and city. There is no strong core in the middle anymore from which these kinds of, this culture of common ground can emerge. When you get a society that is materially that unequal, where wealth, power, voice, and clout are concentrated the way they are today, you're going to get a politics that's more raw, more angry, not wanting to make friends and have spaghetti dinners with people, but kind of think it's a zero-sum world. I got to destroy you in order to save me. That's the vibe we're in right now, right? And so that half of the equation of being literate in power is part of what we teach in our programs, and again, to people of all generations. But the other half of the equation is super important too, and that's the Jim, both of these are in the Jim Ellis book. That book is it's not framed this way. He probably would have, I didn't know him, but I bet he would have felt a little bit awkward about being that explicit about power and naming it, even though he was a master at the framing and use of power. But it is an incredibly instructive guide in what it means to practice civic power. And at the same time, if all we have is a super high literacy and power, and we know how to manipulate people and ideas and money and social norms and media to get what we want, but we have no moral compass or moral core, then all we're getting to be is really skilled sociopaths. And that is our culture today too, of highly skilled sociopathy that gets rewarded and elevated. And so the other half of that equation of civic character, of a set of norms and values and habits and rituals of the kind that, again, are described in this book, that are described in the way that the Ellis family grew up, right? Rewind a bit. A lot of people had brothers die during the Second World War. I don't mean to be kind of coarse about it, but a lot of people had brothers die. Not everybody had a family culture, a spouse, a civic culture around them that said, the way to honor them is not to, and part of what you'll read in the book is that initially after his brother's death, Jim Ellis, was trying every which way he could to get himself into combat, trying every which way he could to kind of, take the risks and put himself in physical danger. And Mary Lou said to him, why throw your life after his? The way to honor his life is to cultivate the values that he embodied in work. That kind of civic faith, like any kind of faith, is made manifest through works. right? And so he chose that path of cultivating civic character. And that was a family culture, and that was a wider culture here that I think if we pay attention to that side, what does civic character look like? You know, Jim Ellis didn't have to deal with a city whose success was so great that we would have tons of people no longer able to afford living here and have a widespread problem of being unhoused, right? That was a different time. This is a different time right now. And so our culture today, you know, Gary's absolutely right that it's, you know, forget about Republicans and Democrats. You can't even get Democrats in King County or, you know, in Seattle to agree on the right solution to homelessness. But I think to the extent that we only think that this is a problem for Girmay and to solve, he'd be like, no thank you, right? The question is, what's our part of this, right? And that's part of what we're trying to teach as well in our work at Citizen Universities, that the coupling of power and character ultimately leads you to ask, what's my piece of this? What's the small piece? So when you talk about making a lot of Jim Ellis's, maybe. Jim Ellis is, you know, maybe, you know, as they say in baseball, he's a generational talent, right? That comes along once every 25, 50 years. But everybody could learn about adding a dose of Jim Ellisness to the way that we move in our communities, in our society. And that, too, isn't just a matter of being inspired and reading stories about him. That is a matter of literacy and practice. You got to, like, sign up and decide, okay, I'm going to be part of the group that figures out what are we doing here with this pop-up encampment of migrants that have come from Guatemala, you know, in our district, in your district. You know, I'm one of your constituents, right? That's around the block from where I live. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? It's gone now already, right? But for a few weeks, the question was, is that someone else's problem, or is that my problem? And I think part of the Jim Ellisness that we could kind of all carry in us a bit more, in addition to a literacy and power and understanding, okay, Girmay is one person we got to talk to. This network of churches is someone else we got to talk to. You know, these philanthropies we got to talk to. We got to get people together to figure out, you know, we got to get REI to donate tents and, you know, everything else like that, you know, to the people.
We're getting tight on time, so I just want you to wrap that up.
Yeah, all I'll say is this idea here is that it's our problem too. That Jim Ellis embodied the spirit of there's no such thing as someone else's problem. And that's really palpable with pollution, but it's also palpable with everything else that we're living through right now.
Okay, a couple more quick questions, and then we are going to open up to the audience to ask a few things before we close today. Girmay, let me just ask you to briefly give a little more color on Build the Bench, because this strikes me as a Jim Ellis project. What are you trying to do?
So when we talk about the problem of people not being civically engaged, I think Eric brought up so many good points. Part of the problem is the how-to guide. How do I even engage? You have Citizens University, you have Build the Bench, you have Mr. Ellis's book, which provides a profound example of how to engage and solve problems. So that's part of what Build the Bench does, is provide people the how-to guide of how to engage in local politics, how to run for office, which levers to pull. And then there's the second piece that I think is sometimes missing, which is representation. Feeling like even if there are the tools out there and I know about them, can somebody like me be the person to participate? And I have a quick funny story that I just wanted to share real quick. You know, Governor Locke shared about how when he was in 6th grade, Mr. Ellis inspired him. When I was in 6th grade, I remember a certain president from South Africa came to visit Seattle, and you know, some people out there who have a more clear memory, I was young, so if I get the details fuzzy, forgive me. But I remember sitting in a big auditorium, and Nelson Mandela walks in, and I remember feeling like, oh my gosh, somebody of African descent can be a president and can lead to so much change. And then I remember a governor being up there too, who my teacher leans over to me and says, you know, that's the governor. I was like, whoa, that's the governor? And he doesn't look like anybody that I've known to be a governor before. And then they told me he went to Franklin High School. And I'm like, I'm going to go to Franklin High School one day too. So somebody from South Seattle who doesn't look like the typical person who is a governor can be governor and can create so much change. And I remember every couple of years I would go on Wikipedia and search, okay, what did Gary Locke do after this point? What did Gary Locke do after that point? And so that's
so you're going to be a Commerce Secretary.
Speaking of a how-to guide,
Maybe ambassador is in your future, too. Sally Jewell, what is timeless and what is of the period when we talk about Jim Ellis?
Timeless is that progress moves at the speed of trust. I think that's who we are as human beings. And learning how to listen and respect others, especially people with different points of view, and the commitment to finding the common ground quickly and working on the things that you have in common, as opposed to the things that you disagree on, is timeless. I think, as I said to Jim on many occasions, today is not like what it was when you were kind of at the height of your work. Organizations don't just make decisions because the CEO says, I want my big contribution to go here. I can't get 6 people in a room from large corporations and get them to support something like the Mountains to Sound Greenway the way you did back in 1991 when we first got it started, because they all were of your era. So now we have processes in how we decide who gets money. We have, more of a desire to listen to different points of view and to decide what our focal areas are that we're going to spend money, and it's not just because of who asked. So I think that has fundamentally changed, and I think that's a good thing, because I think we are now listening to voices beyond those voices of the titans of industry, or people like or all the governors that you were thinking of, maybe with the exception of Dick Seeley Ray, who was very different in a variety of different ways. But I did take atomic energy from her at the Pacific Science Center, by the way, as a 12-year-old. Anyway, I think those are, it's fundamentally a different time, and we need to know what the power structures are of our time and how to work within them. And we need to listen to voices that did not have a voice in the past, and I think that that is fundamentally different. But so much of what Jim taught us, it's in the book, is going to be as true 2 generations, 3, 4, 5 generations from now, because it is about human nature and how we work together. And I will also say, we haven't talked much about Mary Lou, but when Jim got knocked down, if you read the book, it's always Mary Lou that's like, dusting him off, like, let's get going. Okay, what can I do? Even when she was sick, getting out and saying, nope, let's go do this, with that touch that he learned from in terms of how you build trust and how you listen to people from where they are. You don't try and push them around, you try and listen. And she got a lot of things done that Jim was able to take to the next level, but he would have given up, as you will hear in the book, as some of the things that he worked on failed. And there's a lot of those.
And Gary Locke, my final question to you before we open it to the audience. We talk about creating the next Jim Ellises, but what are the next Jim Ellis projects that are kind of screaming for our attention that someone and some group should be thinking about?
Wow. I think many of the problems that we're facing now, first of all, is how do you fund the continuation of some of these infrastructure projects? When someone gives you a new house, well, it's going to work great for the next 25, 30 years, but pretty soon you're going to have to come up with the money to update the plumbing or replace the roof and everything else. And so we're facing some of those issues now in terms of the maintenance of many of these projects that were started under Jim's vision and dreaming. The other thing is that primarily the big projects and the daunting things that affect the quality of life, the essence of the Puget Sound area, are more the social issues, which cannot be measured, cannot be defined, and it's not something that people can grab a hold of and walk around and say, yeah, I like this building, I like the design, I like the architecture. It's housing, affordable housing, homelessness, mental health issues, drug issues, drug abuse, and those are going to be really, really hard, really hard to tackle and to define a measure of success. What is success? What is success? And Jim was always telling us that we have to think long term. We're not going to achieve it overnight. The vision for Puget Sound under forward thrust, was all just part of a chapter of even more projects, from convention center to mountains to sound and everything else. So we need to think long term. What do we want this region to look and feel like 25, 30 years from now for future generations? And then we've got to get people together and start attacking that. It may not be as grandiose as Jim was able to bring people together to accomplish, but we've got to move forward as Eric said, what can we do in our own community and how do we contribute? One thing about Jim's approach, and Sally has kind of touched on it, is that not just bringing people together, but people of even opposing viewpoints to bring them into the process and to also try to address their needs and their objectives. Not trying to steamroll them, because he could have done that. With the titans of industry, when Boeing and Weyerhaeuser and the politicians say, we're going to do this, they can just ignore some of the people who might be affected. But he really tried to make it a win-win for all the folks that were connected. And one big example of that was the Eagles Auditorium, which is now ACT Theater. ACT Theater wanted some funding to renovate that. It had been, even after the convention center was completed, it was dormant, it was vacant, and it was filled with rats. So the idea was to turn that into a theater, get some money for that, but to commit, the theater really wanted to also to raise money for the project to go higher in terms of height. And Jim committed to having some of that money not just going for the renovation of Eagles Auditorium and now ACT Theater, but actually going into senior housing in the areas nearby, trying to make sure that the community felt accepted and had their needs addressed. That's the type of win-win that we need to start thinking about, as opposed to it's a zero-sum game, as Eric was talking about.
Okay, we have time for a couple questions. We got microphones, one running up this aisle. Anyone want to weigh in quickly?
One right there in the middle.
Do we have?
Right here in the middle.
Raise your hand.
There we go.
The easiest. There we go.
Good afternoon. I'm Dick Sandus. I was one of Metro's executive directors, and I'm so glad the book's been published because quite a few years ago now, Tom Gibbs and Dick Page and I went over to Jim's home for lunch on several occasions, and Jim would be writing his book, and he would give us probably the full-blown chapter every time we saw him. But I want to say one thing. I want to say a phrase, better than promised, and that was Jim's assignment for Metro. And I'm going to read to you a portion of a letter that he wrote me in 1989 when I was named executive director. The challenge, of course, is enormous. Not only must Metro complete the projects and operate the systems in an exemplary way, but you must also undertake efforts which will create a public perception of responsiveness. We all need occasionally to be reminded that an essential element of democratic responsiveness is achieving what the voters have requested in a manner which is better than promised. There is a simplistic idea around that responsive government is simply one in which a lot of people can be voted in or out. There are many examples of such governments that have never responded to public need, but have been simply operated a revolving door of political posturing and failure. Well, that was my assignment.
Thank you.
And I'm so proud to have been at Metro with the great people that were there.
Other folks, we have a hand up there. No. Let me actually just, yeah.
Can I just,
Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to that a little bit. Thank you for sharing that letter, first of all. And you know, it reminds me actually back to Marie and how we've come to know each other. To my knowledge, Jim Ellis wasn't super involved in the bond measure, that Libraries for All bond measure that created this building and renovated or created the 27 branches around the system. But it was very Jim Ellis in spirit. And one specific way that your sharing of that letter reminds me of that is that I came onto the library board after a lot of the big decisions had been made, after the bond measure had passed, which Marie and Walt helped to get it to pass, after the city had agreed to this $200 million effort, and now plans were being made to actually build the thing. In fact, I came on after already the design had been chosen for this building with Rem Koolhaas, the architect. And one of the things that we got to remember here is the other way in which we can't all be Jim Ellis is we can't all have both the luck and the gumption and the alignment of circumstance to be the person who starts something. But we are almost always, all of us, going to be the person who stewards something. And who is, I mean, the word we use for board members at the Seattle Public Library is trustees. We're all a trustee of something that somebody started either a few years or a couple generations before us. And what Marie and I had to do in that moment was to make sure, just in that spirit, that now this thing was going to get built in the spirit that was responsive to the public, not just, because it wasn't just a matter of whether Mayor Nichols was accountable at the polls. It was a question of whether the library system was going to listen to people in every neighborhood, hear what their hopes and dreams were about new branches and about collections, and try to make something that felt like they were heard. And that's a spirit in which all of us as stewards, as trustees, can be doing. You don't have to be even on the library board. Just whatever role that each of us has in community, to have that mindset is something that I think is really powerful, and that letter really captured it. Thank you.
Can I add one sentence?
Yeah, and why don't we just go ahead and close out? Let's
Yeah.
just have all of you.
Just building on the point of stewards of Jim Ellis's legacy through King County, I want to acknowledge my former colleague, Councilmember Jeannie Cole Wells, is in the room. If everybody want to. Huge mentor of mine and somebody that I've loved working with. So yeah.
Okay, final thoughts, Sally Jewell.
I hope you read the book. I hope you read it as a fun read, as a love story, as a roadmap, and also to say, how do we apply this to the future? With the generosity of a lot of people in this room who supported the book to get it published, not only have all the archives been digitized, but we're working on curriculum that we hope will be used in public and private schools, using the book as its base, because I learned a ton from Jim Ellis, and I know how blessed I am to be in that position. But we can all learn and shape the lessons of the future by listening to his words, putting ourselves in his shoes, but also in our own shoes shape the kind of civic world we want for the future. So thank you to my fellow panelists, Eric, for your work, professional work in trying to do this, Gurmai for doing it and being the steward, and Gary for being such a wonderful example of political leadership as well as civic leadership in the time that you have been here and what you continue to contribute. So we've all got Jim to thank for a lot of things, whether we know it or not, and I am most thankful. Thanks.
Gary Locke, close us out here.
I don't think, I think we should just close with Sally's comment.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay, we close today, appropriately enough, with the literal offspring of Jim Ellis. Joining us this afternoon are Lynn and Mary Lou's 3 children. They will come forward now with their spouses, Bob, Steve, and Lynn, joined by Jean, Karen, and Mark. Come forward. Let's give them a round of applause.
We got to do some stuff together.
I would love to.
Oh, likewise. This is really...
And they aren't the only ones. Let's get a picture here. We got a moment for a picture. Smile, grab each other's shoulders. Okay. And they aren't the only Ellises. We have many extended Ellises and many generations of Ellises all here in our first and second row. Give them a round of applause. And just to be clear, to raise your hands, we have Steve and Karen. We have Lynn, Jim's daughter. Raise your hand, Lynn. And Mark, her spouse. And then we have Bob and his spouse, Jean. Now, as Sally just mentioned, today marks two big events, the launch of this long-awaited book, but equally important is the transfer of the entire Jim Ellis archives to the public library. So from now on, Jim's letters, his papers, his notes, his interviews, his speeches, you name it, all of that will live here at this wonderful institution for all the community to see. And the book and the materials all meant to inspire the next generation of civic leaders. Now, this box that Karen's holding, it represents a fraction of that archive. We're going to have the Ellises pass it down one by one in just a moment so that they can each touch it for a final time before the entire collection enters the public domain as it is handed to Steve Lanksberry. Sean Lanksberry. Sean's going to be accepting the archive today on behalf of the library, but first we're going to start with some brief comments by Steve Ellis.
Well, thank you very much, and thank everyone who has worked in this. It was an amazing project. Our father would have been extremely pleased with the effort so many of you, his family, his friends, and his supporters, put into making this book a reality after all these years. Jim's family is so grateful to everyone who worked on this project, spearheaded by History Link. We are delighted to see Papo's book in print and hold it in our hands. We hope it inspires future generations of leaders in service. To use one of Jim's favorite expressions of appreciation, and a job well done.
Good show.
Okay, here's the handoff. So there you have it. You can all proudly say you were present at the birth of this great book, this important project. Elliott Bay is here selling copies. You can look at some of the archives on the tables. As we close, we delight you with a song. I'm sorry, Sean has something to say. Sorry.
Oh, it's all good. Just really quick, I just wanted to thank you all. We're honored to have accepted the family archives and Jim's archives, and I hope that he'd be tickled that it'll be available for the public for generations to come. It's a true treasure.